And now, a story from the Appleseed.
When I was a little boy, I grew up in the Smoky Mountains in North Carolina. And as much as anything, I loved to spend time visiting at my grandparents' house. It was my mother's parents, my granddaddy Walker and my grandmother Walker, and they lived on a farm that was, well, you left town with the road paved. And then pretty soon, the road was just paved in the middle with gravel on the side in case you met somebody and you never did meet anybody. And then pretty soon there was no pavement, there was just gravel. And then a little while after that, there was no gravel, there was just dirt. And then after that, there was no road. My grandparents lived in a gated community. My daddy would stop the car and I'd get out and open the gate. And he'd drive through into the cow pasture and then I'd close the gate. And we'd go on these two little tracks down the edge of the cow pasture to the next gate. And then I'd open it and we'd go through and I'd close the gate. And now we were going along the edge of the cornfield till we got to the last gate. And then I'd open it and we'd go through the creek and up in front of this big old log house. And that's where my grandparents lived. My granddaddy was a farmer. He raised rocks. They would come up every springtime when he plowed in the spring. And all summer, he could trap his grandchildren, if possible, into carrying rocks out of the fields. And they'd come back again next year. He was a wonderful, wonderful farmer. He would graft trees. I have his little grafting book. It was published in 1918. And he would create a tree that would have 4 kinds of apples on one tree. Or a tree that would have sweet cherries on one side and sour cherries on the other side. He would graft rose bushes for my grandmother with different roses on the same bush. And his great achievement was that he grafted a quince and a pear. They were very closely related. He had never heard of anybody doing that, but he did it and it worked. He also could find the bee trees, and that would be one of my jobs when I would go spend time out there. I would come with him and we'd go up into a big field of clover above the barn where bees would be flying all around because the clover was all in bloom. You know, what bees do is they go out to gather the nectar, and they go on and on and on and on and on till they're totally loaded. And when they're totally loaded, then they fly straight back to the beehive. And if it's wild bees, they're going to fly back to a hollow tree. So we would go up there in the clover, and he would pick out a bee and start watching it. It would go here and 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 here, and it's getting more and more loaded and more and more loaded and more and more loaded. And all of a sudden, it takes off in a straight line, zoom, and he watches that bee till it goes out of sight. And then he would take me, and he would put me on the spot where he last saw the bee. And then he would come up to where I was, and we'd start watching for bees again. And pretty soon we'd see a bee coming, shoom, past where we were, and he'd keep going. And he'd move me. And he'd see another bee, and he'd keep moving me. And finally, there would be more bees coming, and we would get all the way to a hollow tree that was full of wild honey. And he could do that and find that wild honey just like nobody else that we ever knew. I was about 8 years old, and I was spending a week out there in the summertime, and he came in one afternoon, and he said to my grandmother, he said, "Zeffie, I was way up on the mountain this afternoon, and guess what? The blackberries are just as ripe as they can be. We need to go tomorrow and pick blackberries." Well, the next morning we got up, and my grandmother got us all ready to go. She got me to put on one of my granddaddy's big, long-sleeve shirts that was way too big for me, but then she put rubber bands around it down at the wrists. And then she opened it up at the top, and she got sulfur that she had gotten from the drugstore, and she shook sulfur down inside my shirt and then buttoned it up, and I had to jump around. This is so the ticks and chiggers couldn't get us. My granddaddy got all fixed up the same way. She got all fixed up the same way. She gave my granddaddy a big bucket. She gave me a little bucket, and she got 2 buckets for herself. And we left the house and we went way up past where the cows went. We got way up on the mountain, and finally we came to where there were just acres and acres of blackberry briars covered with great big fat ripe juicy blackberries. She said, now, you need to watch out for snakes, because you know when the blackberries get ripe, snakes will come and hide in the blackberries trying to catch a bird when the birds come and eat the blackberries. So just watch out for them. So I was picking blackberries just like that, one after another. My granddaddy would pick about 3 blackberries and eat 2 and put 1 in his bucket. And my grandmother, with a bucket on each arm, was picking with both hands at the same time. They were going that way. I was going that way. Pretty soon, we couldn't see each other, but that was okay. We knew where we were. When all of a sudden, I heard a little sound. Something went, and I looked, and just about right there was a little baby bear cub eating blackberries. And you know what I thought? That little baby bear cub's not going to be out here by himself. I bet his mama's somewhere. And I looked past him, and sure enough, right over there was his mama. And she had with her not 1, but 2 more little baby bear cubs. It'd have been a fat winter. She had had 3 babies. And all of a sudden, I took off running back to where my grandparents were, but my feet didn't work. My feet just started jumping up and down, jumping up and down. I was trying to run, but my feet were just jumping up and down. And I was yelling, help, 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 help. And here came my granddaddy running. What's the matter? There's bears. And he saw the bears, and he took his bucket and reached in his pocket, and he got out his pocket knife, and he opened up the blade. I thought, he's going to kill a bear with a little knife. No, he got hold of the blade, and he started banging on the bucket. Bam, 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 bam. Go home, bears. Go home, bears. Go get your own black bears. These are our black bears. Woo! Go home, bears. Go home, bears. And that mama bear gathered up those babies, and they took off and left. And we picked blackberries till our buckets were so heaped up they wouldn't even hold anymore. And then we walked all the way back down to the house. We had now 4 big buckets of blackberries full to the top, and I was totally exhausted. My grandmother said, why don't you go lie down, and you can even take a little nap if you want to. And by the time you wake up, I bet supper will be ready. And I went in and laid down on the bed in the room where I always slept. It was a feather bed in there. And when I woke up, the house smelled so good. And I came in the kitchen, and I said, what is that smells so good, so good? My grandmother said, I've spent all afternoon making blackberry pies. Now let's have supper. We sat down at the table, and you want to know what we had for an appetizer? For an appetizer, we had a big piece of blackberry pie. And then you know what we had for vegetables? For vegetables, we had another big piece of blackberry pie. And then for the main course, we had a great big piece of blackberry pie. And for bread, we had a big piece of blackberry pie, but you'll never guess what we had for dessert. 1 more big piece of blackberry pie. I had 5 big pieces of blackberry pie, and I was as full of sugar and happy as I could be. Well, the next day, my mother came to get me to take me home. And before she got there, my grandmother gathered me up, and she said, now, before your mama gets here, let's talk just a minute. You know, when you get home, she always asks you, what did you do at your grandmother's house? I said, yes, she asked me that all the time. It's just dumb. She asked me that. She said, well, she's going to ask you that again. This time I know she is. And maybe you should think about it. And maybe you better not tell her everything that happened. I said, oh, I thought about that. I'm not going to tell her about those bears. Don't worry about that. She said, that's not what I'm talking about. You better not tell her that I fed you 5 pieces of blackberry pie and nothing else for your supper, or she might not let you come back again. And when I got home and my mother asked me what happened at my grandmother's house, I told her all about the bears. Years passed, and I was in high school. And one day we were visiting out at my grandmother's house, and she came over to me and she said, do you remember when you were little, that time we went to pick the blackberries and we saw the bears? I said, I do. And she said, remember what we had for supper that night? I said, I do. I had 5 pieces of blackberry pie. You might have had more than that. And she said, and remember what I told you after that? I said, yes, you told me not to tell my mother about having all that blackberry pie. She said, you know why I told you that? I said, no. She said, I told you that because the truth is important. And we need to always tell the truth. And I told you that for your mother's benefit. Because if you'd gone home and your mother had said, what happened at your grandmother's house? And you said, she let me have 5 pieces of blackberry pie for my supper. What would your mother have said? No way. She would have said, she shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have done that. And then my grandmother looked at me and said, did that blackberry pie hurt you? I said, no. Then if your mother said, you shouldn't have done that, she would have been telling a lie. And I needed to protect your mother from telling a lie. And so we had to be sure that we protected the truth. You see now why I like to spend time at her house? Because almost every time I went, I learned something just about as good as that.
Thanks for joining us for a story from the Appleseed.